Thank you. I paid everyone a lot of money for that introduction. I wrote it, I edited it, I re-edited it till she got it right. Thank you. No, I just want to start by thanking Aruni Kashyap for bringing me to this remarkable community. And I think I want to say a little bit about my friendship with Aruni, because I think it's very important for us, because you're also in a community of writers more than scholars. Because writers, I feel, are harder audiences, more harder audiences than academics. Almost a decade ago, I got an email from a friend who said, there's this remarkable new fiction that's here and I want you to review it. And I said, what? And she says, no, there's this book that I need you to read and review. And I said, what kind of review do you want? And then she said, it's going to be a brilliant review because it's a brilliant book. And I was like, okay. And every time someone tells me that I should do something, my instinct is to always do the opposite. And I was going to destroy this book. Because how can an editor tell me how to review a book before I've even read this book? And then I sat with Aruni's first book, A House of 1,000 Stories. I read, and I read the book with 6 hours. And what I really learned was that how powerful words can be, especially fiction as a form to tell a story of violence that the people of Assam had lived through. But also, this was not fiction that kind of glorified violence, but instead it really showed us what happens to people living under state violence. That each day, every act of violence reduces the way in which you live. Each day means that the circle that you create around yourselves becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And when I finished reading this book, I couldn't rebel as in my usual style. Instead, I wrote what would be a review, which was also the beginning of my literary relationship with his body of work, but also the beginning of my friendship. And today, I'm glad to stand here and talk to you, because so much of what that book represented, and so many of the writers across South Asia who are writing about violence, in some ways are trying to do that. We are really trying to document what's happening to people, especially those living in democratically elected authoritarian regimes. And I think that sentiment will echo with a lot of you here today, because there's this phrase that describes the world's oldest democracy, where we stand, the world's largest democracy, India, and the only democracy in Middle East, and we know what's happening there. So, and it's not just these three phrases that describe these three so-called democratically elected nation states, but rather this trend around the world where we are seeing this relationship between the citizen and the state being completely eroded and remade. One of the arguments that I've made in my first book, my second book, and the larger themes that occupies me and gives me sleepless nights is what happens as we live through this era where the rights of a citizen is increasingly being eroded and reduced to the idea of subjects. We are today no longer than subjects who are surveilled. We are data to be mined. We are bodies to be sent away as indentured labor. We are bodies to be killed. We are bodies to be showed as proof of victory of quelling dissent. So what happens really at the end of the day is, how does one make sense of this? Today I'm going to talk to you about this book, How Long Can the Moon Be Caged?, which is a story of India's political prisoners. And by telling the story of India's political prisoners, me and my co-author, Francesca Recchia, who is not here today, are trying to in some ways tell you a story of what happens to at least once imagined secular Republic of India, now that is being completely remade into something that is now, I don't even know what to call it anymore. It is not an Hindu Rashtra. It is no longer just a Hindu nationalist state. Perhaps it's an Hindu nationalist state that is now transforming into an apartheid state. So how does one not only articulate and document these changes and patterns, but how does one even begin to name the idea of political prisoners? So in some ways today, I was told to keep it very simple because my audience is very diverse. But in the idea of trying to keep it simple, I'm also going to try and lay out some ideas that might be familiar to a lot of you, but also certain ideas and concepts perhaps we can all engage with and discuss once the talk is done. So How Long Can the Moon Be Caged takes the line from a letter by this young student leader called Natasha Narwal. Natasha Narwal is one of the hundreds of thousands of students who took to the streets of India to protest India's deeply authoritarian, one of the many deeply authoritarian, draconian, and exclusionary laws called India's citizenship, national citizenship laws, which for all purposes really wanted to remake the fundamentals of India's citizenship laws, which initially did not use religion as the basis of definition of citizenship, but was going to remake it. As these laws were being promulgated, students across India took to the streets, and in response to this democratic protest, a series of repression happened. And this was not the first time in the history of India this was happening, but Natasha and Devranga Kalita and many, many others were arrested. And how long can the moon be caged? Oh, to speak louder.
From the videographer. Thank you so much.
Okay, I will speak louder. Is this better? So the book, How Long Can the Moon Be Caged, the line takes from Natasha, is one of her beautiful letters from the prison. So now that I've kind of told you what takes, how we came up with the name, I'm kind of going to give you the prehistory of this book. So Polis Project, an organization that I founded in 2017, we started publishing something called Profiles of Dissent. Profiles of Dissent was a series of profiles of India's political prisoners. Before I go into explaining what these profiles of dissent is, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, does the word political prisoner even apply to prisoners in a country like India? How do we really, can we describe these people as political prisoners? Aren't political prisoners people that we find in places like Russia and China and Iran, perhaps? No, the answer is absolutely not. We defined the idea of political prisoner as someone or anyone arrested not for any crime that they committed, but the ideas that they stood for, sometimes for simply existing, often backed by a system of laws that we call an infrastructure of impunity, put together in some ways resembling the Patriot Act in the United States and many other repressive laws that kind of were implemented in many parts of the world the years after 9/11. These infrastructures of impunity, or laws that we call infrastructures of impunity, enable the Indian state to pretty much disappear an Indian citizen into prisons for years without trial. So these are prisoners who have been picked up, and this book particularly looks at prisoners arrested from 2014 when Prime Minister Narendra Modi first came to power. This does not mean that India did not have political prisoners before. And our argument is not that somehow India fundamentally changed the moment Narendra Modi came to power. Indeed, our argument is that the foundations of this authoritarianism and fascism has always been there. India's first political prisoners arrived in 1949, only years, barely a year after India's independence. So political prisoners have existed for a really long time. Also, one of the things that we really wanted to talk about is that the erosion of the constitutional guarantees also did not start with Narendra Modi coming to power. One of the first instances of constitutional erosion started with previous regimes. But the difference, we argue, is that what the previous regimes did in the cover of the night, this regime does in broad daylight, with absolutely no accountability or no impunity. Before, resistance was not seen. While resistance was always, the aim of the state was always to crush resistance. Resistance was not, or dissent, not all dissent was seen as resistance. And I think that is a very important way for us to, a very important point for us to understand. So the book in some ways started coming together initially when we started publishing something called Profiles of Dissent. Profiles of Dissent started as soon as one of the first group of India's thinkers, writers, scholars, lawyers started being arrested, collectively called the BK-16 or the Bhima Koregaon 16. These are some of the country's brightest lawyers, activists, thinkers, all arrested under false premises and evidence that they were conspiring to assassinate the Prime Minister of India. Till date, no evidence of such action has been produced, but what we do know is that all of these arrests were based on manufactured evidence or evidence placed through Pegasus, through surveillance. In some cases, the very investigative officers have said that there is no crime and there is no offense, and yet many of these political prisoners remain behind bar. So initially, by 2021, by early 2019, and by 20, what we really wanted to do, that the number of people being arrested for simply dissenting against the Modi government had grown so much that the profiles of dissent was in some ways trying to articulate and document who was the regime going after, who was being arrested, can we make sense of them? And we really didn't want to do these profiles as these individual stories of heroism, because often the moment you make an individual the hero, you put them on a pedestal, you also do grave injustice by erasing the entire community that is often in resistance. So Profiles of Dissent, while focused on individuals, it was really a story of a community that was in resistance. We placed each of the person arrested within the long intellectual, political discourses within which they grew up, the communities that they were part of, the ideas that they believed in, the dates that they were arrested, why they were arrested, and what laws were they arrested. In some ways giving us both the ethnographic and the anthropological details behind these arrests. And often these profiles of dissent would end with a piece of writing, poetry, artwork by these political prisoners, because they were not just bodies to be arrested and disappeared, but these were people who lived rich intellectual, social, political lives. They were not just martyrs or heroes or activists to be arrested and spoken about only as bodies now incarcerated. As the profiles of dissent began increasing in number, and now that we had multiple things that happened, not only had the BK16 arrests that arrested some of India's finest minds of lawyers and writers and thinkers, in response to, as I said, Natasha Narwal, in response to the laws that were promulgated in late 2019, India saw an organic protest, often centered around something called Shaheen Bagh, where Muslim women took to the streets to protest against these laws, citizenship laws. And in response to these organic protests, what you really saw was the Delhi violence of 2020, which was unleashed on Muslim communities. And the end of this, the very people who unleashed violence on Muslim communities through hate speech and violence were let go, while the very communities that became victims of the violence were arrested. An FIR 59, a piece of document that was the basis of the arrest, arrested, in addition to Natasha and Devangana and Asif Iqbal Tana and others, 19 other young Muslim leaders and students from the community. At this point in time, we wanted to put together, in some ways, an anthology of writings, which could kind of tell us, in some ways, center the voices of these prisoners as a way for us to tell us what were they thinking and what is it that we could do. And as we were putting this book together, our brilliant researcher, Afreen Fatima, who was working with us on this book and with Polis Project, some of you will know Afreen. Afreen's house was demolished soon after a series of protests, and her father was arrested, again, illegally without evidence. As Afreen's house was illegally demolished, the very documents that were part of the book, the very stories, the prison writings that we had collected from across the country, all of which Afreen was helping us put together, was destroyed. Just as the house was destroyed and dispossessed, the very fact of incarceration was also destroyed when the house went down. At that point in time, as we always do at the Polis Project, and as I again said, as I often say, that while this book has my name and Francesca's name as authors of the book, this book was actually an active community. We had researchers like Afreen Fatima, lawyers, activists, scholars across the country helping us put this book together. So we really, at that point in time, realized that this could no longer be an anthology of prison writing. This really had to tell you a different story. And this book, as you see today, that you could hold in your hands, was born as a way of representing and responding to the social reality of what does it mean to document dissent and repression in India. The way that we put this book together, if you do not want anything else, if you do not take anything else from this book, if some of you in this room feel that whatever I say has no value, no meaning, if you think this is fake news, if this is propaganda, the only thing in the book I actually do want you to take with you is a chapter called Name the Names. The chapter, Name the Names, has 250 names arrested since Narendra Modi came to power. These are names of activists, young student leaders, all of them. So this list, the book ends with this list. And what we really tried to do was try and create an incomplete and ongoing list of people arrested by this regime. And these are people arrested for the very simple act of, in some cases, simply existing, protesting and exercising their citizenship rights. So I think that's very important for us to understand, is that the crime that they are often picked up for and arrested for and incarcerated for and disappeared for is the crime of simply exercising their citizenship right, which is the right to dissent, the right to gather, the right to protest, the right to speak, the right to write poems, the right to write an opinion piece, the right to organize, the right to go to court in defense of someone charged unlawfully. And we tried to put together a list of laws under which they were often taken away, the number of days spent in prison, and the names. And I think the list by itself tells you a really dark and dangerous story of where we are. The other thing that we really try to do in this book is to try and map patterns. What are the patterns is that we are seeing when we're talking about political prisoners? Again, the pattern doesn't begin with Narendra Modi coming to power in 2014. It begins much before. We start with the case of people like Binayak Sen, who was a doctor, who was convicted of sedition, again, completely based on the fact that he carried with him, he was sympathetic to the Maoist cause, that he had gone to the prison with the permission of the police to treat a former Naxal leader. Another proof was the list of documents that he carried, which were pamphlets. So this happened much before Modi came to power. The other cases we look at are cases of Jian Sai Baba, which happens in 2014, where a professor from Delhi University, who's also a scholar he's a professor of English literature, someone who's a translator of Nugi Vatyango, someone who's a paraplegic who was disabled because from a very young age, is convicted, is arrested, is actually kidnapped, charged and convicted of waging war against the mighty Indian state based, can you guess on what evidence? The only evidence against him is his bookshelf. The fact that he had articles by Arundhati Roy, Mao's Red Book, and a series of revolutionary magazines, and videos and documentaries about what's happening in Kashmir was all of the evidence required to completely prosecute Jian Sai Baba. Jian Sai Baba was not the only person who was arrested. A series of other Adivasis and students were arrested along with him. Again, the proof was an umbrella, a train ticket, and in some cases, evidence obtained by torture. All law of evidence, especially common law of evidence, is very clear. The law of evidence says that any evidence extracted by the state through torture is inadmissible in a court of law. But the Indian judiciary, despite affidavits being filed that whatever evidence that was extracted from these men was extracted by torture, simply overlooked the law of evidence to go on to convict all of these men of, again, waging war against the mighty Indian state. India is one of the most militarized states in the world. To fight and wage a war against a mighty Indian state, I'm assuming you would at least need a gun as a piece of evidence? No. All that was required was your bookshelf. And then we go on to use the very same patterns that were used in Jian Sai Baba's case, which were learned from the Binayak Sen case for the BK16. For the first time, lawyers were arrested. Till that moment, lawyers were often spared. All of the tricks that they learned and perfected with the arrest and the charging of BK16 was replicated with the arrest of Muslim students and leaders in FIR 59, under which you have both Sharjil Imam and Omar Khalid and many, many, many other Muslim students who have been picked up. You might know the name of Omar Khalid because Omar Khalid gets the most coverage, maybe Sharjil Imam, but there are others whose name you might not even know. But vast majority of these students were again picked up for simply protesting. Another thing that the Delhi violence case and the arrest of Muslim students did was it fundamentally criminalized the act of gathering. If initially they had criminalized the act of existing and reading as seditious, now simply the act of gathering to protest was criminalized. Not unlike what's happening in campuses across the United States today. So let's also not think of this as some kind of a deep, dark civil rights violations happening in still a post-colonial third world country, but these kinds of criminalization of dissent is happening on campuses across the United States as we speak today. And as we try to understand these patterns, one thing that became very, very clear is that by the time this book's manuscript was done and sent away, series of new laws were put in place that are even more draconian today, which means that as of today, any Indian citizen and their bodies can be disappeared within the judicial system, never to be returned again. For all purposes, the law of habeas corpus no longer exists in India today. The law of habeas corpus is also the right which is foundational to all justice and common law systems of justice, that habeas corpus basically means to show the body. Show the body of evidence. Today, no court in the world can demand a body to be shown, that to be proved that this person is okay. So the law of habeas corpus is gone. At this point in time, what does it then mean for a citizen to exist? What does it mean for us to forget dissent, forget protest, forget resistance? What does it mean for citizens to simply exist? The other part of the book is also talking about the communities, the ethnographic work of really speaking to communities that have been left behind once these political prisoners are taken away. And that story, again, is a story, if everything I told you is giving you a sense of doom and desperation, and if you're depressed, then the chapter Communities in Resistance in some ways tells you what it means to not only resist this state, but what does it mean to survive? Why is it that handful of the political prisoners who have received bail, when they do walk out, why are they never depressed? Why are they never sad? Why are they laughing? Why are they smiling? Why is it that when they leave the prison, they are actually raising slogans in praise of the Indian Constitution and democracy? So in some ways, we're also learning that despite these dark, monstrous times, there is resistance. And resistance might not be the way we imagine it to be, but there is resistance in terms of thinking, emergence of new ways of thinking, emergence of new ideas, new people, but mostly the idea that there are still people who continue to write, speak, document, and dissent. I will end this at this moment, and then we can open this up for a conversation and a question.